Ladies, gentlemen, and barbarians of all ages, Season 4 has been a bit of a blast so far, both in terms of just enjoyment factor, at least subjectively, but also in terms of the speed of propulsion from level 1 all the way into the endgame, which is just an objective fact. A few days before season launch, I shared my planned leveling build for Barbarian this season, and I did stick to that nearly exactly pretty much the whole way into Torment, which was double swing Dust Devil. So that build definitely did do its job, but once you reach Torment and start being able to put together an actual set of some descript, start actually having some Paragon points to spend as well, things like that, builds evolve quite a large amount in the game. And what's good and what's bad also change too. So today I'd like to reintroduce you to an old friend named Whirlwind. In the PTR, double swing was the best way to do Dust Devil even at endgame, because the sheer attack speed meant the number of Dust Devils you could make was insane. However, after the PTR, the amount of Dust Devils you could have at one given time got capped at 15, which nerfed that style a little bit, but opened up the idea of Whirlwind Dust Devil, a version of Dust Devil that is much less bursty, less about sending out 50 tornadoes in a split second, and more about having a consistent spray of higher damage Dust Devils in lower quantities. Essentially, we are doing what we can to maximize the concept within the boundaries that have been placed on us since the PTR, and this is the basis of what I believe to be the best Barbarian build for at least the start of endgame, as again, things can change a fair bit later on once you have full masterworking going on and things like that, but this is meant to be a sort of transitionary build that will carry you to that final stage. And to reiterate, I don't recommend moving to this build until you reach Torment difficulty, or at least are willing to use a lot of resources on tempering to actually reach some of the breakpoints that will make it function properly. And it is worth mentioning, I think this is the best thing that you can possibly do with Dust Devils currently in Season 4. All that aside then, the build works wonders, so let's talk about your skill points and where you should put them, followed by your technique slot and how you should use that. Then we'll go over your gear, your legendaries, as well as any uniques that work for this build specifically. Then we'll talk about the tempering system and how to best use it to your advantage, your Paragon board setup, of course, as well, and then finally just any tips that I have from playing it myself so far. Without further ado then, your basic skill basically doesn't matter. Just stick 2 points in here just to let you move on, because this won't be on your active bar once you are ready to switch to this build. From your core, of course, you want to have Whirlwind as well as Enhanced Whirlwind, which gives you Fury when Whirlwind hits an enemy, 4 times as much when it hits an elite, and this is actually a really genuinely important part of this build, as in a way you actually get more damage from the Fury that you generate from this and the Dust Devils that creates than you do from Whirlwind itself. But hey, that's just a fun note. We also grab Furious Whirlwind, of course, which makes enemies bleed for a portion of the damage that they take from our Whirlwind. Then we're going to do a classic Barbarian move here and grab a bunch of shouts. Rallying Cry for resource generation and movement speed, as well as its enhancement, and then also, of course, Tactical Rallying Cry. Then we're also going to be grabbing Challenging Shout, as well as its enhancement, and also Tactical Challenging Shout, which gives you an ability that taunts enemies and gives you damage reduction, bonus maximum health, and also gives you Fury for each time that you are hit while the skill is active. In this cluster, we'll also be taking some passives, 1 rank of Outburst, just mostly as a gateway for 1 rank of Tough as Nails, which gives you some thorns and makes you apply some of your thorns as bleed damage, which lets us have permanent uptime on our damage reduction from bleeding enemies' affix, as the thorns are applied on hit, and thus so is the bleed. We then take 3 ranks of Imposing Presence here for bonus maximum health, which is quite nice to have, and then 1 rank of Martial Vigor for 4% damage reduction from elites, just to spread our damage reduction out a little bit, as that is actually better than just having 1 really high damage reduction stats. Moving on then from that, we move on to our next cluster. Here we'll be grabbing our 3rd shout, of course, which is Warcry, then its enhancement, and also Power Warcry. Altogether again, this gives us a shout that increases our damage, more so when you are surrounded by multiple enemies, then also activates Berserking when you cast it. Then we're also going to be grabbing Charge over here, as well as its enhancement, and then also Power Charge too. This will give you a movement tool, it will give you Unstoppable, and we use it to keep Berserking active as well, and our damage bonus snapshot repeating as a result. It's just a beautiful multi-tool for the build. It is worse than it was last season. They did nerf the cooldown reductions on it, but it is still the best option in that slot without having to invest in things like aspects, which will make Leap do similar things anyways. Then we take some passives in this cluster too. 3 ranks of Booming Voice, of course, to increase the duration of our shouts, which is obviously great. 1 rank of Aggressive Resistance, which gives you some damage reduction while berserking, which is nice because we're going to be berserking all the time. 3 ranks of Battle Fervor to make our charge give us 3 seconds of berserking when it hits an enemy, and then 3 ranks of Prolific Fury to increase our Fury generation while we are berserking as well. Then we're going to be moving on to the Weapon Mastery cluster over here, and we're only going to be taking passives in this. 3 ranks of Pit Fighter for bonus damage to close enemies and bonus damage reduction from distant enemies. 1 rank of Thick Skin for fortified generation when you are hit, and then 3 ranks of Counter Offensive for bonus damage to enemies while you are fortified for at least 50% of your maximum life. And with that, we move on to our ultimate node cluster, and of course here we are going to be taking Wrath Breath of the Berserker. It's just a pure boost to our damage that scales well with pretty much everything else we have, and because we have ways of extending the Berserk duration, we can sort of snapshot the bonus damage buff from this ultimate, and you can literally keep it going up for as long as you can keep Berserk going without having it drop, which, once your build is fully put together, will be permanently. Past that then, we grab 3 ranks of Wallop as a passive here for bonus damage with maces against stunned or vulnerable enemies, and we want to always be using maces as our one-handed weapons when possible, partially because of this damage boost, then partially also because of the utility of Concussion, which we have 3 ranks in here too, and then just the bonus ranks are from Tempering to raise the lucky hit chance to sort of silly amounts, which makes this thing just stun consistently as it spins, which is really fun. Then we just going to be taking 1 rank in Tempered Fury over here, which gives you some bonus maximum fury, but it's mostly a gateway to get 3 ranks into Invigorating Fury for some health regeneration per fury spent. This is less good in a build like this than it is in one that uses like the Unbridled Rage key passive, for example, but it is a solid way to gain some survivability if you're lacking. Other options include dropping these 4 points, perhaps you want to put them in Charge, which would lower its cooldown a pretty fair amount. An even further departure from that would be doing something like removing Charge completely, keeping those ranks, and then going instead fully into the survival side of things and taking Iron Skin instead of Charge, which would let you do something like this, which would make you extremely defensive, but you will only ever really need that level of survival with this if you're doing things that are obviously significantly above your pay grade, things like really high tiers of the pit, or doing things like the 200 Torment bosses, but it is an option for the build that does still function quite well. That said, our key passive within this build then is going to be Unconstrained, which increases the maximum berserking damage bonus, which importantly affects not only our personal player damage, but also the dust devils that come out of us, which is specifically why we generally use this one over something like Unbridled Rage, for example, which only affects core skills. Then moving on past that, we have our technique slot, and this one is pretty simple. Two-handed axe gives us multiplicative bonus damage to vulnerable enemies. This is a very strong bonus, and we aren't using two-handed axes for anything manually, so this is great to just activate passively through this. Following that then, let's talk about any legendaries or uniques that are required to make this function, then just the ones that make it better and better as you find them. First things first, when it comes to unique, there are exactly 0 of them required to make this work in the first place, and I want to really emphasize that. They just make it better. They aren't required to function. That said, the easier one to get is Rage of Harrogath. This will give you these just a lucky hit chance to reduce all of your cooldowns by 1 second when you apply bleed to an enemy. This is awesome to have for our shouts, for our charge, especially in larger group clearing scenarios like Helltide, where it will actually activate pretty frequently. Things like Nightmare Dungeons or even the Pit as well, which again are the perfect types of activities for the early Torment time. And there's also things like Ramaladni's Magnum Opus, which I don't have myself yet, sadly, so obviously that's not in the footage, and that increases the damage that you deal with your one-handed weapons per point of fury that you have, but also drains 2 fury per second. Once you are fully set up though, you have the fury generation to support that properly, and the damage bonus that it gets you with that in mind is pretty impressive. But even without that, this build does pretty silly damage at the point that I'm making this. And then of course, because it is basically now just a thing to talk about with builds, if you had to choose one specific uber unique to use with this, it would be Starless Skies without contest at all. Resource reduction, great for us, and we use core skills constantly, so damage multiplier would always be active. It's just too good to ignore. There's other uber uniques that you would slot in this build as well, but that is the most important one if you do get the sparks required to choose. Moving on to the required legendaries then, the tippity top most important one is Fierce Winds, which you get from the Season Journey for free for completing Chapter 1. So you definitely will have a role of this in some capacity, even if you don't have a high one, and you want this on a two-handed weapon ideally to get more damage boost from the size increase. On your other two-handed weapon, you want the Devilish aspect, which creates whirlwinds as you generate fury, not spend, but generate specifically, which is pretty important to the way that we actually work this build around, is it just lets you really overdo the hell out of resource generation and still gain damage as a result. Then in your amulet for offense, you would want something like Edgemaster here to boost your damage dependent on how full your resource meter is, but for the defensive version that I mentioned earlier with Iron Skin, this is where you'd put something like Iron Warrior to really just absolutely drive home the defense of it all. Your resource legendaries then are of course pretty important to the setup too. We have Bold Chieftains for reduced cooldowns on our shouts to increase their uptime, but then we also have Vocalized Empowerment for fury per second gain while a shout is active, which should be pretty much always. Our other offensive aspects are Dust Devils for Dust Devils created as we use Whirlwind, and then Elements for bonus damage too. This is physical 50% of its uptime, which means that you should take it as half of the value it says on average to our damage personally. This makes it something like equal potency with a legendary like Intercom, for example, and it's honestly sort of a preference between them mainly. But then the final offensive slot I have personally as Accursed Touch. There are more damaging options you could choose than this, but this just gives us a nice consistent source of vulnerable application, which otherwise this build relies either on lower lucky hit chances than this, or on Exploit as a glyph, which is limited in duration. So I find this to help the consistency of the build a hell of a lot. But this is a slot that you could play around with if you really want to mess with other things, even something like Dire Whirlwind as an aspect, for example, to increase Whirlwind's crit chance, which would give you more fury per hit, and also affect our next aspect too on your boots, one of the most important ones of the build, which is the Relentless Berserker. These extend berserking when you hit with core skills, well, already berserking, and this is essentially what keeps us berserking when everything else is already on cooldown. Charge can reset our timer if need be, but it is the backup in case your Dust Devils kill everything before your Whirlwind can actually connect to trigger this effect. Then for our remaining 2 defensive slots, you want Juggernaut pretty undoubtedly for the massive armor jump that it gives you, a deep endgame because of how strength turns into armor as well. Barbarian specifically is a class that can reach armor cap without having this quite easily, but until you reach that point, just put on the aspect. It will overcap your armor, but that is fine, because it just makes you not have to worry about that entire mechanic once you have it on until you reach the point where you just don't have to even use it anymore. Then the other slot is of course going to be Numbing Wrath for Fortified Generation on Fury gained past maximum, which is just a fair bit of both survival and even damage from our passives. Past that, then we should talk about the gear itself. We mentioned that you want to aim for one-handed maces as your main weapons, so the top priority on these is actually item power, because these are what we're using for our actual damage. Then you want to focus on strength, maximum health, and crit damage as the actual affixes. Same stats to focus on your other weapons ideally, though something like 1 roll of resource cost reduction isn't bad, especially if it happens to be a greater affix. For your two-handed slasher, you should have a sword in an even playing field for the innate crit damage that it has, but I have this wicked polearm with double greater affixes that simply just outvalues my best swords by a fair bit as a result at this point. So keep in mind that greater affixes can definitely change this up a little bit sometimes, but ideally you would want a sword. Aside from that, your top priorities are things like cooldown reduction on your helmet and amulet ideally. Resource generation specifically as a stat is great. Crit chance too, things like resistances until maxed out and maximum life increases are awesome too. Worth noting it's not actually worth hunting core skill ranks on your gloves as well for this, as our main damage is actually from Dust Devils, not the Whirlwind itself. But that said, I have attack speed here on these gloves and it's pretty useless for this build. Don't think that means that you should have it. Whirlwind takes into account your base weapon attack speed, which is a large part of why we use one-handed weapons for our Whirlwind here to maximize the damage, but it does not count the actual attack speed affixes on gear at all, so you actually don't want to have those. When it comes to tempering then specifically, you have a few stats that you want to focus on really. Dust Devil size is top priority until you can reach 100% on it. A perfectly masterworked two-handed weapon can even do this on 1 slot specifically, but your early version of this build will likely need 1 roll of this on a two-handed and 1 roll on a one-handed as well to get it actually reaches mirrored cap, as it is the best source of Dust Devil damage scaling until the cap. Then there's the Dust Devil bonus projectile chance skill as well, and this is great, but again only in small amounts. As mentioned earlier, you can now only have 15 Dust Devils at a time since the recent fixes, and so only 1 of these affixes at a time would be fantastic. Maybe 2 if you think you're producing Dust Devils slow enough for that to benefit you, but more than that is definitely too much. And other than that, I'd actually recommend using your remaining weapon temper slot for Dust Devil damage, which is actually a new temper for live servers in Season 4, which simply just increases your Dust Devil damage from the same manual. And you may be wondering why we don't consider this to be higher priority than Dust Devil size, even though it is higher numbers per affix spent, and the reason is that the size damage over here is a separate multiplier, whereas flat Dust Devil damage is additive to things like our Twister glyph, which already gives us way over 400% bonus Dust Devil damage as it is, which turns an affix that says plus 100% Dust Devil damage into just being a 20% damage increase rather than doubling it like it would be if we had no other source of flat Dust Devil increase. Other than that though, your best aspects will be things like Challenging Shout cooldown reduction as well as things like Warcry cooldown reduction. Shouts keep us alive and keep our damage high, so more shout out time means more damage and more survival, simple as that. Resource generation also absolutely incredible for this, and I really like ranks of concussion personally, just help really up our stun values in general, but you can always take some more just general use defensive increases in these slots too. With that covered then, let's move on to our last major subject here, the Paragon board setup, at least up to where I am right now at level 85 here. You want to start off here on the starting board by heading up the right side for the damage and maximum life increases, is up to the glyph socket in the middle, and here we're sticking in the exploit glyph for bonus vulnerable damage and free vulnerable applications to enemies on the first time that you hit them, every 20 seconds after that as well. We then grab the required dexterity in the radius to activate the glyph, then head up and out the left side of the board to reach the exit, where we're going to be attaching on the Warbringer board up here. Then you want to head straight up and take a detour to the left to reach the maximum fury and also fury on kill rare node here, and also the maximum fury nodes around it. Then you want to head back to the right and over to the glyph socket, specifically to stick in the wrath glyph here, which will give you bonus damage with your critical damage effects, but also importantly gives us bonus fury generation whenever you get a critical hit as well. We grab the rare nodes that are nearby and then just enough dexterity to activate the glyph once again. Then we're going to be exiting out the right side of the board while we're attaching on the blood rage board. You want to head immediately to the right and then wrap around to the legendary node itself, which will give you both a chance to gain berserking when you kill a bleeding enemy, which again assists our berserking uptime, which is very important, but also it gives you a portion of your damage while berserking stat as a double dip to just be a secondary damage multiplier, and we easily reach the cap of this stat in Season 4, which is a 30% bonus. Then you want to wrap back around and grab the glyph socket itself, inside of which you want to put the martial glyph for a bonus to the rare nodes in the radius and a cooldown reduction to our non-shout skills whenever we use a shout, which is pretty useful in itself for charge, for iron skin, for whatever you really want to have in that slot. Grab the rare nodes around it as well, and then the strength to actually activate it, then exit out of the top side of the board. In here we're going to be putting on the carnage board. You want to head up the right side to the glyph socket itself of the board, and this is where we're going to be sticking our twister glyph as our main glyph, and this can just stack the most strength in this location of any Paragon board that we have, as you can obviously see here with the ridiculous numbers we have on it. We then grab the rare nodes around it and every single strength in the radius, as well as the damage while berserking nodes too. Then we head out the left side of the board through another damage while berserking rare node and the things that are around it, to then attach on the decimator board on the left here. We head through this board to the glyph socket itself, and in this one you want to put the ire glyph specifically, which gives, you guessed it, damage while berserking, but also damage reduction while berserking from elites, which is quite nice to have too. Grab the rare nodes in the radius as well and the strength within to activate the glyph itself. Then you want to round over to the legendary node itself for a 10% consistent multiplier to your damage when you apply vulnerable to enemies for a few seconds afterwards, and then a further damage bonus for overpowering a vulnerable enemy. We don't really do the overpowering part often, but even without that, this is still a consistent 10% damage multiplier regardless, and that is the end of my own current Paragon point progression, at least for the moment. Aside from that, we should just go over any tips that I have from playing this so far, and the simple loop is to use charge to get on top of enemies, then pop off Wrath of the Berserker and start spinning with Whirlwind. If you need more fury, you're not generating enough, use Warcry next for the damage bonus and berserking duration continue, and then generally you want to save Rallying Cry until afterwards when Wrath of the Berserker itself is over, so that you can make the most of its bonus resource generation instead of overlapping the effects. Then you want to save Challenging Shout for specifically any periods where you are taking high incoming damage. If you're doing an activity that you know is not a challenge for you, you can just use it for the resource generation instead. You can then use Charge as a movement tool, as a crowd control break, or even as a way of just keeping Berserk active in between other activation sources. It's quite useful. And that honestly pretty much does it for today then, everyone. The beauty that is the Whirlwind Dust Devil Barbarian build, tailored and built for specifically this transition point of early World Tier 4, when the endgame really starts opening up, because that is not only the perfect time to switch, but honestly exactly the type of content that this build thrives within. I hope you've all enjoyed this video then, and hopefully you enjoy using the build for yourselves in the game as well if you try it. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.